This is video number 4 for sections 1.5 and 1.6, the domain and range of a function. So this will be brief, just one last concept related to functions. Every time you talk about a function, you can always talk about its domain, and you can always talk about its range. The domain simply refers to a listing of all of the inputs ever associated with that function. In other words, all of the x values. The range is simply the corresponding idea for all of the outputs, so all of the y values of a function. This will be something we'll get into as the semester goes on. This is just a little bit of an introduction to it. Let me go ahead and draw a graph, and then let's see if we can write down its domain and range. I'm going to make another one of those parabolas. So there's a part of it over to the right and another part to the left. Parabolas do get wider and wider as they go along. And I tried to draw it, precisely here. So you can see that the lowest spot on this parabola, that's called the vertex, but the lowest spot appears to be at the point 0, 3. First question, is this a function? Well, we've decided that already. It passes the vertical line test, so absolutely this is a function. Well, if it is a function, then it has a domain and it has a range. Let's write down the domain and range for this particular function. Domain just means please list every single x ever associated with this blue graph. For example, does x equals 1 have a spot? Yep, right there. How about 2? Yes. How about 3? You say, hey, I think this is going to go on and on and on. Well, absolutely. I told you this thing gets wider and wider. So even an x way down here, it might be off the paper, but somewhere up here, you're going to have that x on this parabola as well. The same thing happens off to the left here, which means, look, because these are arrows at the end, because this thing goes on forever, the domain is simply everything. The way we write that is we say all real numbers. In other words, every single number on that x-axis is eventually going to show up somewhere on this parabola. Well, that's a very common answer to the domain or range, all real numbers. So then maybe you're anticipating, oh, it's probably the same thing for the range. It's probably also just all real numbers. Well, not so fast, because now you really have to switch gears. We're not thinking side to side anymore. That's a domain thing. Range is about y values, so we have to think up and down. So I'm trying to think, is every y value imaginable used on this graph or not? Well, I'm thinking there's a bunch that are left out. For example, -1, -2, -3. There is no spot on this blue graph that has a y coordinate that is a negative number. In fact, even +1, +2, they're just not on the blue graph. The lowest y value on here appears to be the number 3. Now, above that, sure, you're there. Here's 4. That actually shows up a couple of times. And then 5 would show up a couple of times. And everybody higher than 3 is going to have a spot on this graph, but nothing under 3. And so the way we say this, the way we say the range, is we say, well, only y's that are larger than or greater than 3. And actually, I need to amend that just a little bit, because 3 itself counts, right? That is the lowest y value, so I need to say greater than or equal to 3. That's how you say the range. All the y's greater than or equal to 3. For now, this is a pretty visual thing. You're looking at the graph and listing out, here's all the x's that ever show up on it, here's all the y's that ever show up on it in terms of coordinates of the points. Okay, let's look at a second, maybe stranger example. So let me label some scale on here. I'm going to count by ones. And this will be a very strange looking graph. It is not going to have arrows. It has sort of a starting point right here, goes up to the y-axis, and then goes back down over here. And this is the entire graph. Okay, I don't really even have a nice name for it. It's like two sticks joined together, two line segments joined together. But that's it. Everything you see, this blue graph, is the entirety of the graph. Is it a function? For sure it's a function. You can start running through vertical lines. You will ever only cross it once, never more than once. So absolutely it's a function. If it's a function, then it has a domain and a range. And so let's see if we can write down for this function what the domain and range are. You probably will not be surprised to hear that the answers are not all real numbers. I mean, how could it be? There's no arrows. The graph doesn't go on in both directions forever. It's a very limited graph. Okay, so what are we going to say? Domain. That means all the x's that ever show up on the graph. Well, I hope it's pretty obvious to you that x's like -3, -4, they're just not on there, right? This graph starts with an x's of -2, and then, after that, all these x's show up on the graph, all the way up until you get to +2, and then that's like the last x that shows up on the blue graph. So the domain would be only numbers between -2 and +2. Now you may not remember how to write that using math symbols, so let me remind you. If you want to say between in math, you put your variable, in this case we're talking about x, surrounded by two less than symbols. And then on the far left you put the lower number, the -2, and on the far right, the higher number, the 2. This is read in math. X is between -2 and 2. And once again, I do need to add the little equals because those ending numbers are part of the domain. Okay, so how about the range? Well, now I have to change gears. I'm not thinking sideways anymore. I'm thinking strictly up and down. I don't have arrows, so it definitely doesn't go on forever. What is the highest y value on the blue graph? Well, of course, it's right here at 3. What is the lowest y value that is used on this graph? Is 2 used? Yep. Is 1 used? Yep. Is that the lowest? Nope. It goes lower still. What's the lowest? The lowest spot on the graph are actually these two endpoints. What's the y coordinate of those two endpoints? Well, in both cases, the y coordinate is 0. So the smallest y is 0, the biggest y is 3. How do you write that down? My variable is now y. It's always the variable surrounded by two less thans. You must put the smaller number on the left and the bigger number on the right. I am including the n, so I'll put the little equals. This simply says, oh, what's the range? Oh, it's just anything, any y value between 0 and 3. All right, so that's the math way of writing down in between. Domain and range can be a tricky idea. Don't worry, we will have many more opportunities to practice it as the semester goes on.